The invitation. Ethan Walker's fingers trembled ever so slightly as he placed the cream-colored envelope on his mahogany desk, its edges trimmed in gold. The wax seal, embossed with the family crest, gleamed under the soft light of his office. His gaze lingered on the address printed elegantly on the front. Maya Carter, the name he hadn't thought about in years, yet the one that had shaped so much of his past. It had been 6 years since their relationship had unraveled in a storm of betrayal, broken promises, and the kind of pain that only love lost could inflict. He had loved her once, deeply, with a fervor he thought was irreplaceable. But Maya had shattered that illusion, and for the longest time, he had allowed that betrayal to define his every action. Time had done little to heal the wound. In fact, it had only sharpened the edge of his resentment, transforming it into something colder, sharper, more calculating. Now, as he sat in his opulent office overlooking the city, he felt a dark sense of satisfaction course through him. He was about to send Maya an invitation to his wedding. The wedding to Olivia Harrington, the woman who would become his perfect trophy wife. But this was not just any wedding invitation. No, this one carried with it the weight of vengeance. Olivia Harrington was everything Maya had never been. She was graceful, poised, and above all, she came from a world of old money, a world Ethan had slowly but surely entangled himself in over the years. The union of their families was not just the joining of two people, it was the consolidation of wealth, power, and status. Olivia was the key to everything he had worked for, a piece of his life that was finally in perfect place. But there was one thing Ethan had never been able to forget: the way Maya had betrayed him. She had left him without a word, disappearing without a trace, as if their time together had never mattered. Ethan had thrown himself into his work, his wealth, and his ambition, leaving the hurt behind in pursuit of something far greater. He had built his empire, a towering achievement of success and influence, but that one missing piece, the woman who had walked away so carelessly, still gnawed at him, a reminder of how easily he had been discarded. The wedding was to be the pinnacle of his life. It would be his moment of triumph, his final act of reaching the top, but it also had one very specific purpose: to make Maya feel the full weight of her abandonment. Ethan wanted her to see what she had lost, to witness the life she could have had if only she had chosen him over the frivolous distractions of her youth. He had no illusions about what Maya had become in the years since their split, probably some other man's consolation prize, clinging to the remnants of a life she had never fully understood. He could already imagine it: Maya standing at the edge of the reception, watching him exchange vows with Olivia. Her eyes would be wide with disbelief, her heart sinking as she realized that the life she had once rejected had grown beyond her reach. He would show her, without a word, just how far he had come, and how little she mattered in the grand scheme of things. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind already choreographing the entire scene. The grand ballroom, the carefully chosen guests, the pristine white dress Olivia would wear, and Maya standing on the sidelines, feeling the sting of her own choices. This would be the ultimate punishment. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Olivia, asking if everything was ready for the wedding. He glanced at it for a moment before typing a quick reply, ensuring everything was set. Olivia was beautiful and ambitious in her own right, but unlike Maya, she had never been a distraction. Their union was based on mutual benefit, and both of them understood that. Olivia had never once questioned his need for revenge, nor had she ever tried to talk him out of it. She knew the story, knew the pain that still simmered within him, and she understood that this wedding was as much about the past as it was about the future. "Everything's on track," Ethan typed back, his fingers poised over the keyboard for a moment before he hit send. He turned his attention back to the invitation on the desk, its gilded edges catching the light once again. Maya had no idea what was coming her way. Ethan had planned everything meticulously. He had already arranged for her to be seated near the front, where she would be forced to witness the ceremony in all its grandeur. She would be trapped in the midst of a celebration that would mock her every decision. Ethan was determined to make her regret walking away from him. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers grazing the surface of the invitation one last time. There was a strange sense of satisfaction in sending it, a feeling that bordered on completion. Once this was done, there would be no more wondering about what could have been. Ethan had already moved on, but Maya, she would always be left behind, living in the shadow of his success. Let her feel it, Ethan murmured to himself, sealing the envelope with a deliberate press of his thumb, the wax crackling under his touch. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations, tastings, and fittings. Ethan's mind never strayed far from the thought of Maya, imagining the look on her face when she opened the invitation. But he was careful, always careful, to ensure that Olivia never suspected his true motives. He played the part of the doting fiancé, the excited groom-to-be, a role he had grown adept at. But in his heart, something darker simmered. On the morning of the wedding, as Ethan stood before the full-length mirror in his private suite at the family estate, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The venue was breathtaking, the decor flawless, and the guests, wealthy, powerful, influential, were all there to witness the culmination of his efforts. Everything had been tailored to perfection. Except, of course, for Maya. She was the wild card, the element that would throw everything into a spectacle. And that was the way he wanted it. As he adjusted his tie, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Olivia, radiant in her wedding gown, her smile bright and full of excitement. She had no idea what was going on in Ethan's mind. To her, this was the happiest day of their lives. "I can't believe it's finally here," Olivia said, stepping into the room. Her voice was warm, but Ethan could hear the faintest tremor of nerves. "Are you ready?" Ethan turned to face her, smiling a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "More than ready," he replied. "Let's make this day unforgettable." And, in his mind, he would. For Maya, it would be unforgettable in the worst possible way. The ceremony was a grand affair, as Ethan had imagined it. The venue was stunning, with towering columns and intricate floral arrangements that seemed to dance in the soft glow of the candlelight. Guests murmured in excitement as Olivia walked down the aisle, the long train of her dress gliding behind her like a cloud of silk. But it was the moment Maya entered the room that would remain etched in Ethan's mind forever. She was there, standing in the back, her eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Ethan held his breath. This was it, the reunion. As the final notes of the string quartet echoed through the grand hall, Ethan's heart raced with anticipation. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as Olivia glided down the aisle, her perfect figure bathed in the soft glow of chandeliers. Ethan stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on her as she approached, the moment of their union drawing near. But behind the curtain of this opulent ceremony, his thoughts were far from the woman in front of him. Maya Carter. She had arrived. Ethan's gaze flicked to the back of the room, where Maya stood, as if frozen in time. She had been given a seat near the front, right in the middle of the most prominent row, as Ethan had meticulously arranged. Her wide eyes scanned the lavish interior, her expression unreadable, but the shock on her face was evident. The years had changed Maya, but in ways that Ethan couldn't quite place. Her once carefree demeanor had given way to a more guarded air, as though she had learned the harsh realities of life in a way he never imagined. Maya stood at the threshold of the room, her entrance unnoticed by many, but not by Ethan. He could almost hear the clock ticking in his head. It was as though everything in that room, all the pomp and circumstance, existed only for this one moment, the moment when Maya realized she had lost him, and with it, the life she could have had. As Olivia reached the altar, her radiant smile brought Ethan back to the present. He accepted her hand, his fingers brushing against the smooth fabric of her gown. The ceremony began, the officiant speaking the words that would bind them together in front of family, friends, and a sea of expensive cameras. But Ethan's attention wasn't fully on Olivia. His eyes kept returning to Maya. Maya was seated now, her back straight, her eyes fixed on Ethan. There was something about her gaze that made his pulse quicken, something he hadn't expected. Was it guilt? Was it regret? Or was it something more? Whatever it was, Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away. The words of the ceremony seemed to fade into the background, a blur of sacred promises and vows that Ethan only half registered. He could feel the weight of Maya's presence, heavy and palpable, as though she were a ghost haunting his every word. This was what he had wanted. To see her here, to watch her suffer in silence, to witness the life she had once rejected in all its glory. But now, as he stood there with Olivia, the vision of Maya's face etched in his mind. A nagging feeling started to creep into his chest. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected. Doubt. He quickly pushed it away, focusing on Olivia's soft voice as she promised to stand by his side, for better or worse, in sickness and health. The words rolled off her tongue with such grace, such ease, that Ethan felt a surge of pride. He had chosen well. Olivia was everything he needed in a partner: beautiful, sophisticated, and most importantly, loyal. Maya had never been that, never truly understood the intricacies of what Ethan had wanted from a relationship. Maya had been impulsive, reckless, driven by the whims of youth. Olivia, on the other hand, had a calm, calculated confidence that Ethan respected. But there was something else about Maya's presence that unsettled him. It was as though her silent observation carried more weight than he had anticipated. As the vows were exchanged, he couldn't shake the image of Maya sitting there, her lips pressed tight, her eyes never leaving him. He had invited her here to witness his success, to make her see just how far he had come without her. But was she truly the one to be humiliated? Or was it himself? The officiant's voice broke through his thoughts as he asked Ethan if he took Olivia to be his lawfully wedded wife. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and for a fraction of a second, his mind flashed back to the years he had spent with Maya. The late-night talks, the stolen kisses, the way she had made him feel like he was the center of her universe. But all of that was gone now. Maya had made her choice, and it had been a choice to leave him behind, without even a second glance. "I do," Ethan said, his voice steady as he looked at Olivia, sealing his resolve. When the officiant turned to Olivia, asking if she took Ethan to be her husband, Ethan's eyes flickered back to Maya, who was now looking down at the ground, her fingers twitching nervously in her lap. She was uncomfortable, he could see that, and that pleased him, in a way. Maya had been the one to walk away, to cut him out of her life without a backward glance. Now, here she was, trapped in the very life she had rejected. "I do." Olivia's voice was clear and confident, pulling Ethan's focus back to the present. As the officiant declared them husband and wife, Ethan didn't hear the cheers that followed. He didn't feel the weight of the golden ring slipping onto Olivia's finger. Instead, all he could think about was Maya. He had orchestrated this moment to perfection, and yet the satisfaction he had anticipated felt empty. Maya was still there, seated in the front row, her gaze now turned to the floor, her lips pressed in a tight line. She had come here to witness Ethan's triumph, but there was something about her quiet sadness that gnawed at him. It wasn't the kind of humiliation he had imagined. In fact, he wasn't sure what he had expected anymore. "Let's go." Olivia's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts as she took his arm, pulling him away from the altar and toward the reception area. Ethan nodded, his hand mechanically gripping hers as they made their way down the aisle, but his mind remained on Maya. Had she truly come here to see him happy? Or had she come here to confront him, to show him that, despite everything, she had never really forgotten him? The reception was a dazzling affair. The ballroom was decked out in lavish decorations, the tables lined with crystal glasses and fine china. Champagne flowed freely, and the laughter of guests filled the air as they congratulated the newlyweds. But as Ethan stood near the bar, sipping his drink, he couldn't ignore the pull of Maya's presence. She was still there, lingering in the background, watching everything unfold. It was as if time had stopped for her, and for a brief moment, Ethan wondered if she was regretting her decision. But no, he quickly dismissed the thought. Maya had made her choice, just as he had made his. She had abandoned him for a life he would never understand. And now he had everything he had ever wanted: wealth, power, and a beautiful wife to match. Still, something in Maya's eyes unsettled him. There was a depth to her stare, something he couldn't quite read. She was no longer the young woman he had known, the one who had made him feel like he was the center of her universe. Maya had changed, and in some strange way, Ethan found that he was no longer sure who had truly won. Olivia's voice broke through his thoughts once again. "Ethan, let's dance," she said, her smile bright and eager. He turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. Of course. As they took the floor, the music swelled around them. The guests gathered in a circle to watch the newlyweds dance their first waltz as husband and wife. But Ethan's gaze strayed once more, landing on Maya, who stood in the shadows, her figure a stark contrast to the sparkling guests around her. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt something shift within him, a crack in the carefully constructed walls he had built. The questions he had buried beneath his ambition, beneath his thirst for revenge, began to resurface. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what the answer was anymore. The unraveling. The night stretched on, with music, laughter, and clinking glasses filling the grand ballroom. Ethan stood at the center of it all, his arm draped lovingly around Olivia's waist as they danced beneath the shimmering chandeliers. To anyone observing, it would have appeared that the night was perfect. A handsome groom, the beautiful bride, the impeccably staged wedding. But beneath the polished surface, something inside Ethan stirred, an unsettling feeling gnawing at his core. Maya was still there. Ethan could feel her presence like a weight pressing against him, pulling his attention away from Olivia, away from the spectacle of the night. Every few moments, his gaze would flicker across the room, searching for her in the crowd. And every time, he found her, standing in the shadows at the edge of the room, her gaze fixed not on him, but on the life he had built, the life he had so carefully constructed, the life she had turned away from. Maya had always been the one who slipped through his fingers, the one who seemed unreachable, even when she was standing right in front of him. But now, in the midst of this celebration, she had become the anchor to his unrest. He excused himself from Olivia with a quick smile, offering her a soft kiss on the cheek before making his way toward the back of the room. His eyes locked on Maya. She hadn't moved, hadn't shifted from her spot by the grand windows. The soft light from the candles reflected in her eyes, giving her an almost ethereal glow, but the expression on her face was far from angelic. It was a look of contemplation, of something buried deep within her, a kind of sadness he couldn't quite place. As Ethan approached, Maya didn't immediately notice him. She was lost in thought, her fingers tracing the edge of her wine glass, her posture still and poised. But Ethan knew the moment she sensed him. Her head lifted slightly, her eyes locking onto his across the room. There was no recognition in her expression, no warmth, no curiosity, just a quiet, unwavering gaze. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. Maya had always been a force, a whirlwind that could shatter everything around her with a single glance, a single word. But now she was distant, like a figment of the past, something that could never be touched again. And yet there she was, standing right in front of him, the very embodiment of everything he had wanted to move past. "Maya," he said, the word escaping his lips almost involuntarily. Her eyes softened slightly, but her mouth remained tight, a faint line between her brows. She set the glass down gently on the windowsill, her fingers lingering on the stem for a moment before she turned fully to face him. "Ethan," she replied, her voice steady, but laced with something he couldn't quite identify. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her words were polite, almost too polite. There was no anger, no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet resignation. It was as if she had come to terms with everything that had happened between them. And now, this moment, this brief exchange, was just another part of the past. Ethan didn't know what to say. The years had separated them, created a chasm that had grown wider and wider with time. But standing before Maya now, he felt the weight of that chasm pressing down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said finally, trying to sound nonchalant, but the edge of uncertainty crept into his voice. "I didn't expect you to. After everything." Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze not leaving his. "Why wouldn't I come?" she asked, the simplicity of her question striking him as much as the words themselves. "It's your wedding, after all. A big event. Lots of people. I wouldn't miss it." Her response was measured, as though she were carefully crafting her words. Ethan felt a pang of frustration deep in his chest. This wasn't how he had imagined this moment. He had expected her to react, to show some sign of regret, to be visibly uncomfortable, to at least give him the satisfaction of knowing she had come here to see him, and to feel it, to feel the life she had let go of slipping through her fingers. But instead, she was composed, indifferent in a way he couldn't understand. "You look well," Ethan said after a long pause, his voice betraying his internal struggle. It was a half-hearted compliment, but one that felt necessary in the awkwardness of the moment. "Thank you," Maya replied, a small, almost imperceptible smile pulling at her lips. It wasn't the smile of someone trying to make peace. It was the smile of someone who had accepted the situation, who had come to terms with whatever had happened between them. "You look." She paused, her gaze drifting over his suit, his posture, and then back to his eyes. "You look happy." The words struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. He had spent so long constructing this life, this perfect image of success and revenge, that he had almost forgotten what true happiness felt like. But Maya's words, simple and matter-of-fact, forced him to question whether he was truly happy or simply satisfied. "I am," he said, his voice tight, as though saying the words aloud would make them more real. "Olivia and I are happy. She's everything I wanted." Maya nodded, her expression unreadable. "I'm glad for you, Ethan," she said, her words still distant, but not unkind. "I really am." The honesty in her tone surprised him, and for the first time in years, he saw a flicker of the Maya he had once known, the Maya who had been capable of both fierce love and quiet strength. She had always been complicated, layered with emotions that ran deeper than anyone realized. But now, as she stood before him, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if he had misunderstood everything. Was this confrontation really about revenge? Was it about showing her the life she had missed out on? Or was it about something more, something deeper that neither of them had ever fully confronted? The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, as Maya's gaze never wavered from his. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form the words, Maya spoke again. "I'm not here to make things difficult for you," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "I'm not here to create drama or make you feel guilty. I came because you asked, and because I wanted to see you again." The simplicity of her statement took Ethan off guard. Maya had always been unpredictable, never one to express her feelings so plainly. Yet here she was, speaking with a calmness that sent a ripple of confusion through him. What did she mean? What had changed in the years since they had parted ways? "See me again," Ethan repeated, his brow furrowing. "Why?" Maya's eyes softened, and for the first time that evening, there was a vulnerability in her gaze that Ethan hadn't expected. "I guess I needed to," she said, almost to herself. "I don't know if you ever really understood why I left, but I needed to. I needed to find myself, to figure out who I was outside of you, outside of us. It wasn't about you, Ethan. It was never about you." Her words were quiet, but they echoed in Ethan's mind like a confession, a truth he hadn't been prepared for. She hadn't left him because of another man, because of some betrayal or disappointment. She had left because she needed to discover her own identity, to understand herself beyond their relationship. Ethan stood there, struck speechless. The anger, the resentment, the vengeance that had fueled him for so long, all of it seemed to crumble in the face of Maya's sincerity. She wasn't the villain he had imagined. She wasn't the woman who had abandoned him for no reason. She was someone who had simply needed more than what he could give her at that time. "I never knew," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with the weight of realization. "I never understood why you left. I thought you didn't care." Maya smiled softly, the sadness in her eyes palpable. "I did care. I cared more than you know. But I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep living a life that wasn't mine. I had to let go of what we had." For the first time in years, Ethan felt the sting of regret, not for what Maya had done, but for what he had failed to understand. The resentment he had carried for so long seemed so misplaced now, so unnecessary. He had held on to a version of their past that wasn't even true. Maya had come here not to humiliate him, not to make him suffer, but to let go of the past once and for all. And as she turned to leave, her figure disappearing into the crowd, Ethan was left standing there, a man undone, finally understanding that the life he had built, the life he had fought for, might not have been the victory he had imagined after all. The reflection. Ethan stood frozen in the same spot where Maya had just left him, her figure vanishing into the sea of elegantly dressed guests, her presence fading into the background of the wedding he had meticulously crafted. The ballroom hummed with energy, the sound of laughter and conversation flowing like a current that he could no longer participate in. Maya's words, her calm, unwavering honesty, echoed in his mind, blocking out the sounds of the celebration. "I had to let go of what we had." The phrase haunted him, reverberating through his thoughts. For so long, Ethan had lived with the belief that Maya's departure had been about him, about a failure on his part, a failure he had to correct. He had spent years chasing success, amassing wealth, building a life that, in his mind, would one day make her regret leaving him. But standing here now, alone, surrounded by the trappings of his carefully constructed world, he realized that he had misunderstood everything. Maya hadn't left him because he wasn't enough. She had left because he had never given her the space to be enough for herself. She had left because he had wanted her to fit into his vision, his idea of what life should be, without ever considering what she needed. The truth hit him like a wave crashing on the shore. He had never truly seen her. He had seen only what he wanted to see, what served his ambitions. His eyes scanned the room, searching for Olivia, his wife. She was dancing with a group of friends, her laughter bright and carefree, her smile one of someone who had everything in the world. Ethan watched her, and for the first time that evening, he felt a disconnect, a separation between them, like an invisible wall had been erected without either of them noticing. Olivia had always been the perfect partner in the public eye. Her beauty, grace, and poise made her the ideal match for someone like Ethan. But now, as he watched her with a critical eye, he wondered if their union was anything more than a carefully curated image, a display for the world to see. Was this really happiness, or was it simply the next step in his pursuit of validation? He felt a pang of guilt, a growing awareness that his feelings for Olivia, while real in some ways, had been more about securing his future, about achieving the life that his family and society expected of him. In the process, he had lost sight of what mattered, what truly made him happy. But that realization wasn't enough to quell the unease that had taken root in his chest. Ethan excused himself from the crowd and made his way to a quieter corner of the ballroom, a space where the noise seemed to fade and the weight of his thoughts could settle in. He needed to think, to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. He leaned against a marble pillar, the coolness of the stone grounding him as he tried to make sense of his emotions. It wasn't just Maya's departure that was weighing on him. It was the realization that he had been chasing the wrong things. His entire life had been built around the idea of success, of winning, of proving to the world that he was capable, that he was worthy. But in his quest for validation, he had alienated the one person who had truly known him, who had understood his vulnerabilities and imperfections. And now he was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of his own desires, a life that, despite its outward appearance of perfection, felt empty. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling a deep breath, as the weight of it all crashed down on him. He had spent years living in the shadow of his ambitions, using his wealth and status as armor against the pain of rejection. But the armor had never been enough to shield him from the truth that now felt painfully clear. Maya had been right. He had been so focused on building the life he thought he wanted that he had lost sight of what really mattered. The years they had spent together, those moments of joy, of connection, of intimacy, had meant more to him than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. And when she had left, when she had walked away from him, he had been so consumed with pride and anger that he had never allowed himself to grieve. Instead, he had buried his feelings beneath layers of success, convinced that if he had everything he wanted, he would no longer feel the sting of loss. But now, standing here in the midst of a celebration, surrounded by wealth and accolades, he realized that it had all been a lie. He hadn't moved past Maya. He hadn't even come close. He had simply buried the pain so deep that he had convinced himself it no longer mattered. A soft voice interrupted his reverie. "Ethan." He turned, startled, to see Olivia standing before him. Her expression was curious, concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked, her tone gentle. "You've been quiet for a while." Ethan forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside. "Yeah, just needed a moment," he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, that his mind was swirling with doubts, that he was questioning everything about the life they had built together. Olivia stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "You've been a little off tonight," she said, her brow furrowing. "You're sure everything's fine?" Ethan hesitated. How could he explain what he was feeling, when even he didn't fully understand it? How could he tell Olivia that in the middle of his own wedding, he was struggling with the realization that he might not be the man he thought he was? "I'm just tired," he said finally, the lies slipping easily from his lips. "It's been a long day." Olivia nodded, though her gaze was still searching, probing. "Well, if you need to talk, I'm here," she said softly, her fingers squeezing his arm in reassurance. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were miles away. He couldn't shake the image of Maya's face, her calm composure in the face of everything he had put her through. She had left, yes, but in doing so, she had reclaimed her power. She had found herself, something Ethan wasn't sure he had ever fully done. As Olivia led him back toward the center of the room, the weight of his internal struggle grew heavier. He smiled and nodded as people congratulated them, but inside, the questions continued to churn. Had he made the right choice? Was this life, the one he had fought so hard to create, the life he truly wanted? Or had he built something on the ruins of a relationship he had never fully understood, with a woman who had been far more than just a stepping stone to success? The evening wore on, the festivities continuing as planned. But for Ethan, the night had taken on a different hue. Every laugh, every toast, every congratulatory word felt like a reminder of something he couldn't ignore. He had invited Maya to his wedding to prove a point, to show her what she had lost, to humiliate her in front of everyone. But now, standing here with Olivia, surrounded by people who adored him, Ethan realized the truth was far more complicated. The victory he had once so eagerly anticipated seemed irrelevant now. His life, his success, had come at a cost he hadn't fully understood until it was too late. He had invited Maya here to make her feel small, to force her to face the life he had built without her. But it was Ethan who had ended up facing the most uncomfortable truth of all. He wasn't as secure as he had believed, and in his quest for dominance, he had lost something far more valuable, something that no amount of wealth or power could ever replace. As the night wore on, and the guests continued to celebrate, Ethan knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He had come to this wedding with a heart full of revenge, but now he was walking away with a heart full of regret. The reckoning. The days following the wedding felt like a blur to Ethan. What should have been the pinnacle of his success, the culmination of years of ambition and hard work, now hung over him like a cloud of uncertainty. The world continued to spin on its axis, people continued to congratulate him, and Olivia remained by his side, her radiant smile never faltering. But beneath the surface, Ethan couldn't shake the nagging sense that everything was unraveling. In the weeks that followed, the smooth veneer of his life began to crack. What had once been a carefully orchestrated existence, filled with the trappings of wealth, success, and love, now seemed brittle and hollow. He couldn't get Maya's words out of his head, couldn't stop replaying the way she had looked at him that night, her eyes filled with a quiet clarity that seemed to pierce through his carefully constructed facade. I had to let go of what we had. Every time Ethan tried to drown out those words, every time he pushed them aside in favor of the glamorous life he had worked so hard to create, they seemed to return with more force. There was something about the way Maya had said it, as if she had found peace, something Ethan had never truly known. Her departure had been painful for him, but it had also been a form of liberation for her, something Ethan had never understood until now. The realization gnawed at him. It wasn't just the absence of Maya in his life that he mourned. It was the absence of himself. She had walked away from him, yes, but in doing so, she had walked towards something far more important, a life that was authentic, a life of her own choosing. Ethan, on the other hand, had kept building, stacking success upon success, thinking that it would fill the emptiness inside him. But all it had done was create an illusion of fulfillment, one that now seemed to crumble with each passing day. His relationship with Olivia, which had once seemed so perfect, had begun to feel like a performance, a role he had slipped into with ease, but without passion. He had married Olivia because she fit the mold of what he thought he wanted: beauty, wealth, social standing. She was everything he had been taught to aspire to. But as he spent more time with her in the days following the wedding, Ethan felt the growing distance between them. Olivia was lovely, charming, and kind. She had been nothing but supportive, always there to cheer him on and stand by his side. Yet the more he saw her, the more he realized that their connection was based on convenience rather than genuine emotional intimacy. There were no late-night conversations about their hopes and dreams, no spark of excitement in their shared moments. They had been two strangers who had found a way to coexist, but never truly connect. Ethan's mind drifted back to the night of the wedding, to the fleeting moment when he had spoken to Maya. He hadn't expected her to be so calm, so composed. She had left him years ago, and he had built his life on the assumption that he had been the one wronged, that she had betrayed him by choosing to walk away. But her words, her honesty, had shattered that illusion. Maya hadn't betrayed him. She had simply chosen herself, and in doing so, she had forced Ethan to confront the truth about his own life. As the days passed, Ethan became increasingly restless. His thoughts were consumed with Maya and the choices he had made. He found himself questioning everything: his marriage, his career, his pursuit of power. What had it all been for? He had convinced himself that success would bring him happiness, that wealth and status would fill the void inside him. But now, it felt like nothing more than a hollow shell. It wasn't long before Ethan reached a breaking point. He couldn't ignore the gnawing discomfort any longer. One evening, after a long day at the office, he found himself standing in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The man staring back at him seemed unfamiliar, like a stranger who had forgotten who he truly was. He had spent so much time chasing validation from others, from the world, that he had lost touch with the person he used to be, the person he had been before the drive for success consumed him. In that moment, Ethan made a decision. He needed to find a way to reclaim his life, to rediscover who he was outside of the walls of his opulent office, the luxury cars, and the sprawling estate. He couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine when it felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own choices. The first step, he realized, was to speak to Olivia. The truth couldn't be avoided any longer. He owed her the honesty that he had denied her for so long. He needed to tell her that their marriage, while not based on malice, was built on an illusion of happiness, not the real thing. He couldn't keep pretending that he was content with the life they were living. That evening, as the sun set and cast a warm glow over the city, Ethan found Olivia sitting in their living room, reading a book. The tranquility of the scene contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside him. He hesitated for a moment, gathering his thoughts, before finally speaking. "Olivia," he began, his voice tight with emotion. She looked up from her book, her face soft with concern. "We need to talk." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she nodded, setting the book aside. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About everything." He paused, unsure how to articulate the thoughts swirling in his mind. "I don't think I've been fair to you." Olivia's eyes widened in surprise, her voice gentle. "Ethan, what do you mean? You've been nothing but kind and supportive." "I know it," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But that's the problem. I've been living my life like I'm playing a role, like everything is a performance. I married you because I thought it was what I was supposed to do. You're perfect, Olivia, but I've realized that what I thought was perfect wasn't what I truly wanted. I've been living in the shadow of my own ambitions, and I'd lost sight of what really matters." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between them. Olivia's gaze softened, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. She stood up, walking over to him slowly, as if unsure how to respond. "I thought we were happy, Ethan," she said softly. "I thought we were building a life together. But now I'm hearing this, and I don't know what to believe." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling a deep ache in his chest. "I wanted to believe it too, Olivia. But I've been lying to myself. I've been so focused on building the perfect life, the perfect image, that I lost sight of what was real. And I can't keep living a lie." Olivia took a step back, her hands resting on her hips as she processed his words. "So what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you telling me that you want to end this? That you want to walk away from everything we've built?" Ethan felt a pang of guilt at her words, but he knew that he couldn't keep pretending. "I don't know what the future holds, Olivia," he said quietly. "But I know that I can't keep going down this path. I need to find myself again, and I need to figure out who I am, apart from all of this." He gestured toward the house, toward the life they had created. "I owe you more than this. I owe you honesty." There was a long silence as Olivia stood there, her eyes searching his face. Ethan could see the hurt, the confusion in her gaze, but there was also a quiet understanding. She had known, on some level, that something had been wrong. She had felt the distance between them, the disconnect that had grown over the years. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I think I need some time to process this, Ethan. I don't know what to say right now, but I understand what you're telling me. And I think we both need some space." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had known this moment was coming, but hearing it from her was a different kind of reality. He wasn't sure what the future held for him or for Olivia, but one thing was clear: he couldn't keep living in the past, trying to piece together a life that wasn't meant to be. As he left the room, his mind still reeling, Ethan realized that the reckoning had only just begun. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was a road he would have to walk alone. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't the hope of perfection or the hope of success. It was the hope of rediscovery, of finding himself once again. And maybe, just maybe, in the process, he would learn what it truly meant to live a life that was his own. The rebirth. The days after Ethan's conversation with Olivia were a blur. The air in the house felt thick with unspoken words, with emotions too raw to be processed in the moment. He had expected anger, perhaps even resentment. But instead, Olivia's reaction had been a quiet resignation, a kind of acceptance that mirrored his own. She had always been the picture of grace, and now, in the midst of his unraveling, she had remained composed, though there was an unmistakable sadness in her eyes that lingered even as she went about their daily routines. For a few days, Ethan stayed in the guest room, not because Olivia had asked him to, but because the silence between them had become too deafening to bear. The luxury of their sprawling home felt like a cage now, a gilded prison that he had built for himself and now could not escape from. It was a strange feeling, to be surrounded by wealth, comfort, and success, yet feel more alone than ever before. During those first few days, Ethan found himself caught in a whirlwind of emotion. The intense urge to reconnect with his old self, the person he had once been before the ambition, the status, and the superficiality consumed him, was overwhelming. It felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to jump or turn back. He had spent so many years pushing his feelings aside, burying his vulnerabilities, that now they flooded his mind all at once, overwhelming him. He needed to get away. And so he did. Ethan booked a one-way flight to the small town of Mendocino, a place he had once visited with Maya. He had no intention of finding her. He knew that chapter of his life had closed, but something about the town called to him. It was a place he could go to think, to clear his mind, to remember who he had been before life had become a series of carefully planned steps. It was a retreat from everything he had known, a space where he could begin to piece together the fractured parts of himself. Mendocino was a far cry from the bustling streets of San Francisco. It was quiet, small, a town where everyone seemed to know each other, and the air smelled of salt water and pine. The contrast was stark, but in that contrast, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs, the gentle rustling of the trees in the wind, it all felt like a balm to his soul, a way to slow the constant noise in his head. He rented a small cottage near the water, an old weathered place with a view of the Pacific. It was the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. There, he spent the first few days alone, wandering the beach, reflecting on his life, and processing the chaos that had unfolded over the past few weeks. The clarity that had eluded him for so long began to come into focus. Ethan realized that he had spent so much of his life chasing external validation that he had lost touch with the most important thing: his inner self. He had become so focused on proving his worth to others that he had neglected to ask himself the simple question: what did he truly want? The idea of redemption started to take root in his mind, but it wasn't the kind of redemption he had once imagined. There would be no grand gestures, no sweeping changes overnight. This kind of redemption was about self-acceptance, about making peace with his past, and learning to live in a way that felt true to who he was, not the version of himself that others expected him to be. The mornings in Mendocino were serene, with the golden light of the sun casting long shadows across the rocky shore. Ethan would wake early, take a long walk along the cliffs, and let the cool ocean breeze clear his mind. He spent hours reading books he hadn't touched in years, books that weren't about business or success, but about life, art, philosophy, and love. Slowly, he began to rediscover the things that had once sparked joy in him, the things that weren't tied to accomplishment or status. One afternoon, after a particularly reflective walk along the beach, Ethan sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching the waves roll in with rhythmic consistency. The ocean was wild, untamed, yet there was an incredible peace in its chaos. It was a stark reminder that life, like the sea, was never meant to be controlled. It was meant to be experienced, to be felt, to be lived in its fullness, with all the highs and lows. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, his phone rang. It was Olivia. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of their conversation still heavy on his heart. He had known this call would come eventually. He had known that they would need to talk, that the time for avoiding the truth was over. With a deep breath, he answered, Ethan. Olivia's voice came through, soft and tentative. I've been thinking about what you said, about everything. And I think we need to have a real conversation. I want to understand, Ethan. I want to understand why you did what you did, why you pushed me away when I thought we were building something together. Her words hit him like a jolt, but there was something in her tone that made him realize this wasn't an interrogation. This wasn't a fight. This was the start of something deeper, something real. I've been doing a lot of thinking too, Ethan said, his voice steady but raw. I've been trying to figure out who I am, outside of all the things I've been chasing. I don't have all the answers yet, but I know that I've hurt you, Olivia. I know that I've taken you for granted, and for that, I'm sorry. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Ethan could almost hear the wheels turning in Olivia's mind. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now, less guarded. I don't know where we go from here, Ethan. I don't know what happens next. But I can't pretend like everything is fine anymore, just because it's what we've always done. We need to figure out what's best for both of us. Ethan nodded, though he knew she couldn't see it. I understand. And whatever happens, I want you to know that I respect you. I always have. They talked for a little longer, but the conversation wasn't rushed. There were no conclusions drawn, no promises made. It was just the beginning of a long and difficult process, one that would require patience, understanding, and perhaps time apart. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Not the hope of a quick fix or a perfect solution, but the hope of reconciliation, of understanding, and of growth. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan continued his time in Mendocino, immersing himself in the quiet solitude that had become his sanctuary. He began to write, not with the goal of achieving success or recognition, but simply to express the thoughts and emotions that had been buried for so long. Each word felt like a release, a step toward healing, toward becoming the person he had once been, before he had let the pursuit of power and validation take control of his life. Maya never crossed his mind again, as an object of regret or revenge. She had been the catalyst for his transformation, but Ethan had realized that the person he needed to reconcile with wasn't Maya or Olivia. It was himself. Maya had chosen herself all those years ago, and now Ethan was learning to do the same. In the quiet beauty of Mendocino, Ethan found a sense of peace that he had been searching for all his life. There were no grand revelations, no dramatic moments of clarity. But there was something more profound, an acceptance of the ebb and flow of life, of the mistakes he had made, and of the journey he still had ahead of him. When he returned to San Francisco, Ethan was a changed man. He wasn't sure where the future would lead, whether it would lead him back to Olivia or to a different path altogether. But he knew one thing for certain. The life he had been living was no longer the life he wanted. And that, in itself, was the beginning of something new. The rebirth wasn't in the world he had built. It wasn't in the mansion, the fortune, or the social circles he had once coveted. The rebirth was in the quiet acceptance of who he was, stripped of the armor of wealth and status, ready to rebuild from the ground up. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough.